It is my pleasure to introduce Alan Dicken to you this evening. Alan is the Associate Director for Immigrant and Refugee Response with Week of Compassion, helping to equip and empower congregations for responding quickly to refugee and immigrant crises that may occur. Alan graduated from Bethany College in 2009 with a BA in Religious Studies, spent a year as a global ministries intern in Honduras, bienvenido, then graduated from Union Theological Seminary in New York City in 2013 with an MDiv and a focus in pastoral ministry and theology. Alan was ordained in June 2013 and served at Carthage Christian Church in Cincinnati, Ohio, then as the Ohio Regional Program Director before coming to Week of Compassion. He has been living in Florida, in Orlando, for 2 weeks now, but originally hailed from Cincinnati. In this role at Week of Compassion, Alan collaborates with individuals, congregations, organizations, and ecumenical partners to serve the needs of people throughout the world. It truly is an honor to have you, Alan, here with us tonight. Please join me in a warm welcome for Alan Dicken.
Thank you all so much for having me. We're really just going to have kind of a conversational presentation. Yes, there are slides. Hopefully that's helpful in orienting and directing the conversation and also getting me back on track when I inevitably get off track. We do have plenty of time for questions and conversation at the end, however, and you may find that some of your early questions may be answered by some of the later slides. So I'm going to ask that we do our best to kind of hold off on some questions until the end. But if you have a burning question, or if I really you're sure that I'm not going to get there, feel free to call it out. That's totally fine with me. It's really okay. So I am here on behalf of Week of Compassion. I started in this role on February 14th, and at the end of February, Russia invaded Ukraine. And so for this ministry, which was a little new to begin with, we really hit the ground running. And so we've been responding to many different congregations, people, outside partners, inside partners, trying to work through what this crisis is looking like now and how it will unfold and what we can do in our response as the Christian Church disciples of Christ. And so hopefully what I am presenting here today will address a lot of what your questions are and where you're coming from with this. But I'm always happy to learn more and bring back more information if things come up that I have no problem saying I don't know. There are so many things that I really don't know. And things change every day. And so I'll be happy to have this be really the beginning of hopefully an ongoing conversation that we can be having. So this is just our kind of tagline. It's not exactly our mission or vision statement, but it's a little bit of our identity, I guess, as Week of Compassion. And I'll probably go a little bit more into this and into our vision and mission statements because I think that it's important for us to know we talk a lot about Week of Compassion, I think, as the church, and I think we talk about it in a positive way, but I think it's important for us to make sure that we're all on the same page when we're talking about what Week of Compassion is and what it looks like. So here's a brief overview of how I see the evening going. Hopefully you can read that. If not, I will do my best to read through it real quick, do a little introduction, go into the situation in Ukraine. I'm not going to get too into the details, but hopefully share some relevant updates as it pertains to our ministries as disciples. Talk about our Week of Compassion partnerships and our international response. Then I'm going to do a little bit of, I hopefully not too tedious dive into what the refugee process looks like here in the U.S., because that kind of background will be helpful in understanding and informing what we can do in our ministry. So that's the part I can really get lost in the weeds about. So you'll have to pull me out if I really start going too deep. But that'll also inform our next part where we talk about Week of Compassion's domestic response. And then we'll transition a little bit more into what you can do, Exodus Ministries, which I'm not going to explain now. I'll keep you in suspense. What is Exodus Ministries? Stay to the end and find out. And then we'll have questions and conversation after that. So this is the mission of Week of Compassion, the Relief, Refugee, and Development Mission Fund of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. And so this is probably not that new to us, but there are some changes, some shifts within the denomination where you're starting to see Week of Compassion traditionally has been thought of as a fund, and now we're seeing some more programming and some more ministry engagement out of Week of Compassion as well. And it is to address the crises that happen. And unfortunately, we are seeing increased crises, both natural disasters and human-made disasters, which has led to Week of Compassion's recent kind of expanding in our personnel. For a long time, it was kind of a two-person team. Our executive director, V, and our disaster response coordinator, Caroline Hamilton-Arnold, were basically just spinning a plate over here, spinning a plate here, spinning a plate here. And so now we have expanded to a staff of 5. I think some of you may know somebody, Courtney something, who is our wonderful communications director, and she is absolutely brilliant. I don't have to tell you all that, but so grateful for her and her ministry. Myself, I am new, and then we also have a woman, Riza, who is from Oregon, and she does disaster response organizing for both natural disasters and human-made disasters. So the vision is simple. The vision is a world where God's people transform suffering into hope. These are the core values. I'm not going to read all of them for you, but I bring this up because it's important for us to not think of Week of Compassion as separate from the church. And I don't mean separate from the disciples or separate, from the Indiana region, but that it's really an extension of Geist. That this is an extension of all local congregations. That when Week of Compassion is there, all of our churches are there. And so that we really, there've been some language in the past of, when you partner with Week of Compassion, but we're not partnering together like that. We are one church, and this is the expression that is the disaster relief expression of the church. And so we want to really be sure that we are clear with our language and making sure that congregations know that we do this work together, really. And so that's important for us to know that and to have that framework going into the conversation we're going to have tonight, I think. Okay, the situation in Ukraine. Now, I'm not going to get into all the details and the history of the region. We can all read all the articles from the Washington Post and the New York Times and everything, and there's so much that you can read about. And it will change and update every day. In fact, as of this morning, when I was going back through and fact-checking some of my materials that I had prepared, I had originally written almost 5 million displaced people. And as of this morning, that threshold has been crossed, and now it is over 5 million refugees who have left Ukraine. Of those, 90% are women and children under the age of 18, and most of the remaining 10% are elderly. And so it is prominently a women's refugee movement, which we don't always think about it in that way. We just think of refugees maybe a little bit more broadly. But if you were to go to any of the refugee camps in Poland, you would see predominantly women. Of all ages. And that's not necessarily unique to refugees in Ukraine. That happens fairly frequently, oftentimes, especially in responding to war. You see it's far more often the women and children who are the refugees, and the men often will stay behind. But it is kind of almost especially the statistics, whole families aren't leaving together in this. It's a lot of women and children, and a lot of the men are left behind. That number of 5 million people does not include internally displaced people, meaning those who have had to leave maybe the city where they live in, but can't or haven't been able to leave the country yet. And so that number, when we use refugee as a term, it can skew the idea around how many people are actually being displaced from a conflict like this. So of those, 50% are in Poland, most of the rest are in Hungary, Romania, and Moldova. It is about 12% of the population of Ukraine now that are refugees. About 1 in 8 people have fled the country. So you can imagine that is massive. That is actually just a huge number of people in such a short amount of time that have fled. And so what are we doing about it? So now these are partnerships. So I know I said earlier that we have external partners, but we don't really have internal partners, because internally we are the church. But externally, we do have partners. And the big one is ACT Alliance, when these kind of international situations happen. And the ACT Alliance, I thought I had really high ambitions of sharing with you all of the member organizations. And there are 132 of them. So I just said, okay, well, we'll just say it's from the ACT Church of Sweden to the Zimbabwe Church Council, and everything from A to Z. And if you look at it online, it'll say the Christian Church Disciples of Christ Week of Compassion, because we are the body that represents the church to ACT Alliance. If you see, I think it's the Presbyterian Disaster Relief is the same. They're the ones representing Presbyterian, so it's not uncommon that denominations will have their disaster response be represented in the ACT Alliance. The ACT Alliance is not its own nonprofit, so if you were to look it up online and go, oh my gosh, we're sending all this money to this group that doesn't even appear on any of my nonprofit websites, it's not a nonprofit, it's a member organization. So all of these congregations, churches, denominations, nonprofits from around the world come together as the ACT Alliance, and we will trust our partners around the world to be able to handle the situation in their own backyard. So sometimes if there are big disasters here, like let's say Hurricane Katrina, the ACT Alliance will have funds that come from the ACT Church of Sweden, the Zimbabwe Church Council. They will send it to Week of Compassion to be able to help out with Hurricane Katrina. And so we are then the receiving partners instead of more of the giving partners. But in this instance, we are more of the giving partners. And so what we do, and this kind of ties into a broader theme here of how disciples tend to do a lot of this work, especially internationally, is that first bullet point that I skipped over, the ethos of acompañamiento, which is a Spanish word, but it's a cognate. I bet you can guess it. It means accompaniment. And the idea is we'll never know Ukraine better than Ukrainians, so let's not have our people try to go over there and tell them how to set things up. Similarly, in our global ministries programs, we don't have international mission stations so much as we have international mission partners. So when I was in Honduras, we don't have a disciples center in Honduras. We have Hondurans in Honduras that we work with and that we collaborate with. And so I went for that year as an intern and served in their offices and built relationship and did the work that was asked of me for development work there. And so similarly with the ACT Alliance, we trust our partners in this work to be able to do the work that they know needs to be done in their own backyards. And another big partner in that, and they're a little tricky because, well, I'll just get into it a little bit here. So Church World Service, which my guess is you may have heard about, they do the crop walk. Sometimes they do buckets or boxes that you send to disaster relief. Everybody's nodding. Oh, this makes my job so much easier. So Church World Service, we are one of the Protestant denominations that make up Church World Service. V, the executive director of Week of Compassion, sits on Church World Service's board. They are also a member of the ACT Alliance. So we kind of run parallel. But CWS focuses very heavily on refugee work internationally and domestically. And so we get constant updates from them as far as what the situation is internationally and how that will impact us domestically. So that last bullet point of CWS updates, I get weekly updates from CWS. V, the executive director, gets weekly, if not more, frequent updates from CWS just about Ukraine. This does not include all of the other crises that are happening in the world. And I don't know if some of you have seen some of these news stories lately that crises can sometimes stack on top of each other if we're all so devoted to this one. But other things are also happening in the world that we're needing to be able to address as well. And so, but CWS does a great job of helping to filter and funnel some of those communications for clarity, and so that we are working together in how we address these problems internationally, so that the Methodists don't say, well, we'll go and do this, and the Baptists say, well, we'll go and do this, and disciples say, we'll do this. If we work together, we're able to channel and be more effective. And disciples, we're so good at that, right? Our ecumenical, bells are ringing. We just go, let's do this work together. This is our bread and butter. We love it. So that's how we do the work. That's kind of the idea and the nuts and bolts behind it. You may have seen recently, I think just last week, we sent an update, or it might have been the week before. Last week was Holy Week, and sometimes our brains get muddled. But there was an initial gift from Week of Compassion of $250,000 to Ukraine relief. And that we need to be very clear about, that being an initial gift. There already, before we sent that much, there was more money than that has already come in to go to Ukraine support. But we know that any disaster relief, whether it's from a hurricane or a humanitarian crisis, requires both short-term and long-term recovery. And so we want to listen to the needs of our partners and determine what is most helpful now and what will be helpful in the long run. And so the initial $250,000, and there will be constant updates, by the way. We will keep telling you when we send the donations that have been given, where those are going, and how those are being utilized. But when we sent that $250,000 to Ukraine relief funds, primarily, not exclusively, but primarily, it went to the European Baptist Alliance in Poland. They are one of those ACT Alliance members. And the Reformed Church in Hungary, which is also an ACT Alliance member, and double whammy, one of our global ministries partners. So we already have a very close relationship with that Reformed Church in Hungary. And so we were able, and the UCCs did this as well, our international work, global ministries, we do in unity with the UCC Church. So their disaster relief also sent a lot of their funds to the Reformed Church in Hungary. And so that when it got to those partners, it was directed exclusively to the basic needs of the refugees who were coming out of Ukraine. So basic needs are food, water, shelter, medicine, and sometimes travel, especially if folks had family or people that they could go to in other parts of Europe where they were able to get in. not, again, I'm going to try really hard not to get too into it, but not every country in Europe is letting people in at this point. Yeah, we'll just leave it at that. But sometimes it will go to travel, if that's possible, to be helpful in more individual cases for the refugees who are leaving Poland in that way. So that's an amazing gift that in such a short time, in I think it was less than a month between when the appeal went out and when the first round of giving went, $250,000 came from disciples to immediately meet the basic needs of people leaving Ukraine. So thank all of you, and thank disciples around the country, Canada, around the world, who are able to contribute and make that possible, which it's really amazing. Okay, so now's when I can get into it sometimes, so please bear with me. And I know that graph is small. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit now about understanding the refugee process in the United States. I'm going to take a drink of water because here we go. Yes. That is so helpful. That is very, very helpful. That is very helpful. And I will circle back to this more later, especially when we get around to Exodus, because I'm assuming we're doing that through Exodus. Excellent. That's what I thought. We'll talk more about record keeping as well. When I came into this role, I went, okay, who's doing this? And everybody in the church went, oh, we don't know. I said, I'll find out as I go. All right. So all refugees start out as asylum seekers. An asylum seeker is somebody who is leaving their country to go to another country because they're being persecuted for any number of things. It can be race, gender, religious identity, political identity, as long as they have a credible fear that it is not safe for them to stay in their home country. They are seeking asylum and they need to go to another country in order to be safe. A refugee, the technical term, you become a refugee basically when the UN processes you as a refugee and gives you a thumbs up and stamps your papers and says, okay, you are now a refugee. Now, we tend to throw around the phrase refugee to just mean any kind of displaced person that is moving internationally to try to find safety. We don't need to get into the super technical details about it, but just to let you all know that there are differences between an asylum seeker and refugee. Historically in this country, and technically legally even now in this country, an asylum seeker has to come to a border and present themselves in order to declare asylum. Now, many news media outlets and others would tell you that that is illegal. It is not. That's actually supposed to be the process of how somebody claims asylum, is they come to the border and say, I need asylum. They are not always legally treated the way they should be upon making that request. But if we are looking a little more specifically at Ukraine, which let's narrow it down, that's what we're talking about here today. For Ukrainians, more specifically, technically they are, yes, asylum seekers, but because the UN is so involved, almost all of these people are being processed as refugees relatively quickly. Now, this does not mean that they are being processed as refugees preparing for entry into the United States. That is a different level that requires interviewers from our State Department who can process those people to be able to come into the United States. Now, you've heard that we are going to I don't know if you've actually heard this or not, but the Biden administration has said we will accept 100,000 Ukrainians. And those numbers, it's so fascinating, these numbers. Because on the one hand, we see, oh my gosh, 5 million refugees right now. What is it, 100,000? Come on, we can do better than that. And then you look at what do we normally do in a year? Well, there was a time where we were getting pretty close to about 100,000 refugees a year. Annually, we were getting closer to that number. For the past 6 years, it's been an average over those 6 years of closer to 20,000, and in 1 year it was around 11,000. So, and we don't need to go into all of that, but I do think, to be very transparent, the previous administration really cut a lot of our refugee resettlement programs, offices, personnel, staff, so that even though this administration may be saying we can welcome 100 Ukrainians, we do not have the infrastructure. There are not the people who are processing that many applications. We don't have people able to do that many interviews. We don't have as many refugee resettlement offices around the country as we did 5 years ago. We simply do not have the capacity to do 100,000 Ukrainian refugees anytime soon. Most estimates through Church World Service and other refugee resettlement agencies are 8 to 12 months is when we think we might start to see those numbers. Now, you may hear news stories of some Ukrainians that have gotten to southern border coming up through Tijuana. Yes, here and there, those numbers are very small and are not representative of that 100,000 that we are planning to take in. But Alan, didn't we just take in like 70 or 80,000 Afghans? Well, I'm sure you all know. That Afghanistan situation technically was not, they don't count as refugees. It's such an interesting distinction because of that crisis and because of that evacuation recently the number has passed 80,000, so I know initially there was 70,000 was the number that got thrown around a lot, but 80,000 Afghans have been resettled here in the United States, and they are not technically considered refugees. They were not interviewed. They do not have case files coming into this country. Many do not have a lot of the things that a typical refugee process would have. It was just this emergency, get these people here. Who knows what will happen with Ukraine? I feel like I may go around and say to all these churches, well, the Ukrainians aren't in the same boat as Afghan. And then, of course, as soon as I say that, there'll be a new law, and they'll say, okay, well, we're just going to start bringing them over. So I'll just have to go back to all those churches and go, okay, I was wrong. It's happening now. Get ready now. So for now, I will just say for now, there's the timeline that most refugee agencies have, and this is just an internal thing that gets thrown around in conversation. It is not okay, on our books we're planning that. This is just the idea is probably not for 8 to 12 months. And so we'll see. We will see how that unfolds, how that will continue to unfold. The graph there is meant to share just a sliver of the world's refugee crisis. And that box, you probably can't really see it, but there are about 5 million Ukrainians adding on to that existing stack of Syrian, Palestinian, Venezuelan, Sudanese, and Myanmar are the kind of the big blocks of refugees currently. Now that number, if that says 34.4 million, and then you add in the 5 million Ukrainians, you're getting pretty close to 40 million. Now these are the UN processed refugees. Most people that work in refugee work estimate about 80 million refugees currently in the world today. That is, I think it's the equivalent of like the 13th largest population country in the world, are just people who are displaced. So that's I hope that wasn't too much when we look at the refugee situation here. So what is our domestic response? And so you all have some understanding, and we'll get into this in a little bit here. But the map that's kind of in the background of that, I don't know how well you can see it. It looks like the U.S., and there's a bunch of dots all over the place. So I'm going to talk more broadly about Week of Compassion's response, and then we'll narrow it down to maybe Geist here. So all of those dots are refugee resettlement agencies around the U.S. Most are found within probably a decent-sized metro area, because refugee resettlement agencies do a lot of the social services that refugees are going to need in the first 90 days especially, but in the first 5 years that they are coming to this country. Refugee resettlement looks very different now than what it did in the 1980s, which is when a lot of this movement, especially with churches, kind of got started. Excuse me. So a lot of times if you're talking with other people about refugee resettlement work, sometimes that will feel too big for a church to be able to do, that they don't have the money or the capacity, can't promise the time to be able to do that for 5 years for a family. Well, anymore, the refugee resettlement centers handle so much of what used to be tasked to churches. And so now the resettlement centers are those faith-based organizations that we work with. So Church World Service, for example, is one of the resettlement agencies. They have those dots all over the country. Some of those are Church World Service. So once the refugees get cleared from the United Nations, once the U.S. interviews them and says you're good to go, then they will talk with the 9 resettlement agencies and say, okay, it makes the most sense for you to go here. That's Church World Service. We'll filter you through Church World Service. Church World Service takes it to Indianapolis. They go to Exodus and say, okay, here is your person. So that's the process of how they get there. So all those little dots, those are the places where they will arrive. Now, all those resettlement agencies are so very different. I am so glad that you have already begun a relationship and are doing things with Exodus. Exodus is really great. I'm not sure who exactly you're working with, if it's Jericho Brown. Oh, that's so great. Okay, great. He told me that was going to happen. I didn't know that was happening yet. That's exciting. Sorry, I got a little sidetracked there. So these resettlement offices are very, very different. If you're talking with other churches in Indiana, you all are very lucky, because Exodus has a radius. They will work with any congregation within 100 miles, which gets you pretty well covered around here. As to just give you some alternatives, Lexington works within the city limits of Lexington. And so if you're talking with other disciples, or if you're sharing, oh, we had this great conversation. I share this because this happened once. I did talk with a congregation, and I said, oh, in Dallas, it is free 99. They cover everything. Churches don't need to put a cent into it. They can co-sponsor for 6 months for free. And that church told some other churches, they're like, oh, get in touch with Alan. It's free everywhere. And I have had to go back and say, that is a Dallas thing. That is not everywhere that this is free. So you're in a very good place because you are able to be so close to an existing center with Exodus. But if you are talking with disciples around the country and they say, oh, we heard that you all are doing this work with Afghans through Church World Service, what's that like? You just need to be very clear that this is our situation. To find out more about your situation, get in touch with Alan, and he'll help you walk through that process. And I'll be happy to do that with them. I mean, it's great if you're a church in Dallas, but oh man, that was a tricky situation. So those are the resettlement offices. And then we have been fielding a lot of conversations from congregations that are wanting to do this work, but they just don't know if they can for a couple of reasons. Maybe they're too far away from a resettlement office. They're just not close enough geographically. Or maybe they're close enough geographically, but they just don't have enough money to be able to do it. Or maybe they have the funds, but just not enough personnel. They just don't have a good, consistent team, but they like the idea of it. They just can't quite commit. And so a big part of what I am trying to do, and this is going to be a great lead into where we go next, is that we are a network of congregations, you know? And none of us, just like at the very beginning, none of us do this alone. We are all expressions of one another. And we, just as Week of Compassion is an expression of disaster relief, if you all are working with an Afghan family here, that is an expression of disciples doing resettlement work. And so we are working to do partnerships, and I'm going to share two quick stories about partnerships. One comes from Los Angeles, and it was through a lot of conversations, and it finally took me just looking at a map, because everything is First Christian Church blank, right? You know, I don't have to tell you this. Oh, First Christian Church, Orange, California. First Christian Church, Santa Ana. First Christian Church. They're all within 10 miles of each other. But I thought they were in such different places because they said First Christian Church of a different city. It's all just LA. It's all LA. But we had one church that they had a vision and a passion and so many committed members. But for their resettlement agency, they needed almost $6,000 to do it. And they couldn't make that happen. But there was another disciples church across town, and they were considering maybe closing, but they thought, well, maybe we can give to some local mission and outreach of some other congregations here. What can we do to make that happen? So they reached out to me to see if I knew anybody who could help with the refugee situation. And then there was another church, and they had like a furniture thing where they were helping a homeless center, and part of their ministry was they had like one of their old big fellowship halls was just full of furniture that people could come and take. All right, well, I don't know if you know this, but you could really use that if you're doing some refugee resettlement work. And so these congregations, none of them could have done it on their own, not one of them. But, you know, if we engage in conversation and work together, then they did. They've been able to resettle an Afghan family and through this program out in LA, which is great. That's what we want to see, right? Now, Columbus, Ohio, had a bit of a different situation. They have a very big church there, very, very big church, and they've been doing this work for a very long time. And there's some rural church that's maybe 50 miles outside of Columbus. They would love to do it. They have people, they have money. They're just not close enough. They just can't get there. Well, what we were able to do, we were able to connect some of the leaders from those two churches. And the big church that had done this a lot of times, they had a rotation of teams. They had a team of 8, and it was just basically every 6 months, the next team up they would do it, and then the next 6 months, it was the next team, and they would just kind of rotate. Well, they decided that what they were going to do was they were going to have, for as long as the rural church that was further away, for as long as they wanted and as long as they had volunteers who were committed, that they would send 1 or 2 members from their church to join and be a part of that team of 8. So they may not be able to go to every single event, but they could coordinate with them to say, well, we can definitely drive in on Saturdays. We'll take Saturdays. We'll drive in on Saturdays, and I will take the kids to the park or the zoo, or we'll do what we can do on Saturdays. And that was it. That's all that rural congregation could commit to. And honestly, the big church probably could have done it on their own, but they wanted to be a part of a broader expression of the church and recognizing the vision and mission that this rural church had to be able to be a vessel and an opportunity for them to live out their calling of refugee resettlement work. Why should only the urban congregations get to do it? Just because they happen to be geographically closer? And so I thought that was a really a beautiful and a kind of a humble thing for that bigger church to do. I'm sure it added to their logistical problems. I'm sure that it probably made their process it was well honed. I mean, they were every 6 months, it was next team. You knew what you were doing. And they said, you know what, we're willing for it to be a little messy if it means being a part of a broader church expression to another group that has a passion for this. And there are other examples around the country as well. There's a great big church in Louisville, and they've been doing it for a while. And what they did is they kind of did a similar thing to Columbus, only they kind of did a mentoring thing where they had about half of their team was from another congregation in Louisville that wanted to do it, but they weren't sure if they wanted to do it, but they couldn't commit, but they thought maybe they could. And so they said, well, let's just have a few members basically try it out. And we don't want to mess it up, so you guys can correct us if we're doing it wrong, but we'd like to see, do we have the capacity for this? Can we have the volunteer hours? Can we make this happen the way that we need to in order to do this faithfully? So the bigger one in Louisville kind of almost became a training, if you will, for the other one. And then the smaller church came in and learned how to do it, and they said, oh, this is a lot easier than we thought. This isn't as hard as we thought it was going to be, and so now they do it on their own. But they probably wouldn't have if they hadn't partnered with that other disciples church and said, okay, let's do it with you. So I lied. It was 3 stories. Exodus refugee. I'm not going to go into all this. You guys know all about this already. Now, it is a little different between Afghanistan and if you are engaging in other refugee programs. Also, to be very honest, it's so nice that you're already doing Afghanistan work, because I do have to have a conversation sometimes with churches about, I have to phrase it delicately, but what is it about Ukrainians that makes us want to help them when there have been refugees from other parts of the world? Because once I connect you with a resettlement agency, you don't get to pick your refugee. We did have, this just stays here. I did have one phone call from someone who I think they just maybe were a little misinformed about what the work of Week of Compassion was, but they say, yes, we would very much like to help. We have room in our house. We will give a car. We will take in one Christian English-speaking Ukrainian family, please. And I just had to really disabuse them of the notion that that was anything that was going to happen through Week of Compassion or anyone. That just was not going to be in the cards. So we do need to, and it sounds like there's already been good work here, but sometimes we do need to have a broader conversation about refugee work beyond just Ukrainian response. And if we look at that graph from earlier, a lot more of those refugees are black and brown people and not just the Ukrainians. And I know they're in the news a lot today, and I know that folks want to help, and that is good, and we don't want to discourage that at all. It is good to have a heart for refugee ministries. But does that heart continue and extend out to other neighbors that we have around the world that could use just as much help, and that will continue to need help? So Exodus, refugees. Does anybody here maybe want to share just briefly, and maybe, the next thing is a little bit about conversation anyway. So maybe this is our tipping point into conversation, because I'm not sure that everybody here knows about Exodus ministries, and I don't know exactly what your involvement is with them. So if maybe somebody could share a little bit about your partnership with Exodus, that might be a good sharing for us. Yes. So the part that I said that would just stay here? Oh, thank goodness. We'll just edit it out. Just bleep it out. Make it sound way worse.
Well, I speak for a larger group here, not just myself, but we decided some months ago to get involved in some kind of refugee resettlement, not knowing at the time there would be the Afghan crisis.
Evacuation, yeah.
We were hoping to get someone in the family who spoke English, and we did. And Exodus was an immense help in making this happen. Since then, and many of us have met with the family, 3 darling girls. They're wonderful, caring parents. There have been a few bumps in the road. One is Social Security card went to another state instead of here.
Oh, gosh.
Well, that wasn't just a matter of, okay, tomorrow it'll come back, but eventually it did. There have been some shopping trips, some, I don't know what else.
Doctor's appointments.
Oh, dental and doctor appointments, various things.
Maybe a bank.
And people in the congregation have jumped in and said, yep, I'll take them. The only really difficult thing, and it's not that difficult, but instead of living across the street, they live 45 minutes away on the other side of town. But you know what? It's a pleasurable trip, in a way. It really is. I'm extremely proud of the people who have jumped in. We've had someone donate a car.
Wow.
It's just amazing what can be done.
Wow.
Jump in.
I'm jumping in. I'm Deb Strock-Custy, an associate pastor here, work at the Promise Road campus. But I pulled a group of 45 or 50 people together last fall, and I was looking today, and almost all of the people that signed up to help have done something in the last months. Exodus, our partnership with Exodus was officially for 90 days, as you have up here. We were co-sponsors, and that co-sponsorship has just finished, like the 15th of April or so. However, that does not mean our partnership with this Afghan family is anywhere near finished. But in that 90 days, we did help with furnishings, getting the girls set up at school, medical and dental appointments. One of our church members is helping with language lessons at their apartment fairly frequently. And the outpouring from this congregation you can be very proud of. You can be very proud of yourselves for the work and the love and the mission that has been accomplished with Exodus's help. Exodus also calls me once a week. 1:30 on Tuesday afternoons, we have a date. And we check, and they're very good about asking, so what's gone on this week, or what can we help you with, or can you please help us do this? They will ask me, and I say, oh, I've got just the person that can help with that, or oh, I'll have to dig around and see if I can find somebody. But it's a great thing. We started with Jericho Jones and had in the midst of deep COVID stuff, we had a Zoom introduction, and then he went on paternity leave, and we picked up with Cassandra Sanborn, and I see the name of Chelsea Foster. She's one of my buds on the phone every week, so it's a very good thing they've got going down there at Exodus. It's very good.
That's great to hear. I'm very glad to hear that.
Yeah.
Thank you. And thank you all. Thank you for being a congregation. And I'm going to take some of your information at the end, and we're trying to have a better record of disciples all over the country that are doing this work, because it's happening more often than people think. But it's not a story that's often lifted up. And it's a really great, and I think a very important expression of who we are as a church, that we see this as a priority, and that we kind of have done it, not totally in silos. There have been refugee work, there's been refugee work happening around the country for a long time, but oftentimes this church in this part of the country goes, oh, maybe we'll do it, and then this church goes, oh, maybe we'll do it. And what if we just saw how many beautiful flowers are growing up all over the country, of all these refugee programs that disciples have been taking on all on their own, which is really great to see. So that led us pretty well into questions and conversation. So if you have questions over things that I have said and or around where we go from here, I would be more than happy to have those kinds of conversations or questions or anything else. Just ask me anything. Go for it.
Where do the organizations like Exodus and CWS get their funds?
So they get some of their funding from the government, actually. It depends on what we're talking about specifically. So each refugee, when they come in, they get $1,225. That's it. So if it's one person, that's what they have. And they're supposed to be self-sustaining after those 90 days. I would love to see any of us last 90 days on $1,100. But if you're a family of 8, multiply it by 8, yeah, okay. So they do get some funding from the government, but that goes specifically for those families. That doesn't go toward their offices or administration or that kind of stuff. So we give to Church World Service through Week of Compassion. They're one of the partners that we donate to financially, and there are, I want to say, 9 different Protestant organizations that donates more specifically to Church World Service. I don't remember all of them off the top of my head, but they're all the ones that are too small to do it on their own. So the Lutherans have their own international service, their refugee service. Episcopalians have their own. Catholics have their own. And then, Methodist, Presbyterians, Disciples, UCC, Baptist, we all work together to do Church World Service. So that's a lot of their funding will come through their member organizations, and then they also get grants and stuff from the government for specifically the needs of the refugees. I'm so glad I covered everything so well that nobody had any questions. That makes this so easy for me. So I have questions for you all. What are other disciples churches in Indianapolis that you all have relationships with? It wasn't meant to be rhetorical. Or a gotcha question. I didn't want it to be or what are other disciples churches? Okay. That's awesome. They meet on the other end of this building on Sundays at 11 o'clock. Very cool. Two disciples churches geographically to us would be Allisonville Christian Church and First Christian Church in Noblesville would be our two closest. Indianapolis has a lot of disciples churches, obviously. Oh yeah. Yeah, I meant that because I'm learning. I did. What I'm learning is that as I've been doing this a little bit more, is that sometimes there are churches like you all that are big and good and strong-minded, and you have clear vision in these things, which is really great. And there are, like I mentioned in some of those stories, there are other churches in the area that just don't have that. Now, my goal is not to make every church be a refugee sponsoring church. That's not my ministry. That's not my calling. but it is to make it possible for any church that wants to do it to be able to do it. And so when I get calls, because I view it now as when, not if. When I get calls from individuals and congregations around Indianapolis, I'm going to send them your way. And now I know that Exodus has a 100-mile radius. You all are on the hook for a lot of land. Poor Lexington, they only can help each other out just right in here. But you all, basically, you got the state covered. If I have churches or individuals coming to me that want to help. And you'd be surprised, too. There's a church out in Iowa that's about an hour and a half from their local resettlement agency, but that's also where the nearest Target is. And so they said that they're fine driving that far. That's how they normally drive. In my head, I'm like, that's all the way, that's clear to Cincinnati from here. That's a whole other resettlement office. But, you know, you'd be surprised. There may be some folks where you go, oh, you're too far away. Well, you can donate to our funds, and we'll say that you did the work with us. And they may go, we love driving to Indianapolis. We come in to see the Colts all the time. So I say that just because I'd love to hear from you all if there are churches that you would think of or be interested in partnering with, but also so that you know that I will be thinking of you and partnering with you all. So it's not a whole church, but you mentioned that this family is about 44 minutes. Which way? West. Okay, perfect. That's exactly what I was going to bring up. I had dinner with Maggie Archibald. She goes to Avon. I knew it. Started with an A and had a V in there. Avon Christian Church out that way. And she is very interested in doing refugee work and is not sure if her church is, but would like to maybe bring it to them. So what my next steps are, and I know that you all already know Maggie, or some of your leadership already knows Maggie quite well, but I would try to work at seeing, well, what does this look like? Is this a partnership? Are they going to do it on their own? Do they want to have Maggie just come over here and learn from you all? Because once you're already in it, I mean, it's not like the mafia, but you're in it for life. I don't know if you knew that when you signed up, but I don't mean that to say you have to do it, but I do mean it to say I could see the joy on your faces when you shared about this experience. And I know that, you know, as you continue to be in relationship with this Afghan family, that there will probably come a time where Exodus will call you and say, we have another family that needs help. Can you help? And there's just looking out at you all and listening to your stories, there's just not a doubt in my mind that you would go, yeah, how can we help? And so how that looks may change and shift, and your partners may change and shift, but we may need you to be a congregation that shows some other individuals or other congregations how to do it too. And so I may lean on you a bit, just as a heads up. Hope that's okay. Courtney said it was fine. She said I could do anything. So, yeah. Yes.
Your portfolio is Immigrant and Refugee Response. So along with the refugee side, what in the broader just immigrant picture is going on? Are you working some with Sharon, Stanley, Ray, and Natalie Teague also, or
yes?
Thank you.
So Sharon Stanley Ray works through Refugee and Immigration Ministries in DHM, and these roles are kind of complementary. Sharon does an amazing job, especially at advocacy work. So she's based in DC, and not all of her work, but a lot of it is focusing on how do we shift policies around these things. You know, it's kind of a both and approach. Sharon uses this metaphor, and it's not my favorite one, but I haven't come up with a better one yet. She said, if somebody's throwing babies in the river, we need somebody to pull the babies out of the river. I know, right? Okay, I know. We need somebody to pull the babies out of the river, right? But we also need somebody to go upstream and say, like, why are we throwing the babies in the river, right? So the advocacy work is that kind of upstream, hey, let's stop that. And then there's the downstream work of, okay, they're here. We're not going to just focus on trying to tell them to stop. We got to get them out. And so it's the kind of both and of, all right, how do we do the congregational work of, all right, these are the folks that we're going to be walking alongside, and do the advocacy work of, just quit throwing those babies in the river. I really have to come up with a better metaphor. I hate it every single time I come. It's such a nasty metaphor. But that is a roundabout answer to say, so my portfolio with immigrants, a lot of what I do is to help the congregational work. And so I respond to what the congregations are kind of trying to bring to me sometimes. And sometimes if there are more specific needs, which I'll go back to Dallas, there's a community of about 70,000 immigrants from many different parts of the country in that metroplex area. DFW is just huge. I don't know if you've ever driven out that way. I mean, it is just sprawling, and tucked away in that massive amount of city is a population of about 70,000 immigrants from all over. So refugees are also a form of immigrants. And if they, become naturalized citizens, they're still, immigrants. That's a part of a process. It's a whole thing, a whole spectrum. So some of what I do, there was a church, Northway Christian Church in Dallas, was they had a new pastor that was from that community, and they were trying to figure out ways that they could partner. So I kind of talked with them and did some brainstorming and tried to reach out to some of the nonprofits in the Dallas area that were already doing work that church could partner with. I will say that a bulk of my work is more responding to refugee crises, because that's what more congregations are asking for help with. But that's not to say, that it is to neglect the broader immigrant communities that also have needs, and churches that are wanting to partner in those ministries as well. But we're working on building up more of our ability to respond to the refugee crises when they do happen. So. Other questions? So how would you all feel about, show of hand, who all has done work with the Afghan family? Oh, great. Great. And how would you all feel if somebody from another church jumped in and did that work, if you didn't know them? But I'll tell you their disciple. Well, they'll show up with a chalice on. Is that okay? If they're wearing a chalice, will you allow it? What if a whole other church comes to you and asks, hey, show us how you did this?
They already have.
Ha-ha! Who has? I need to know these
I don't
things.
remember their name.
It's okay. They don't have to be disciples either. That's
No,
the great part.
they were a disciple church, and they were working with Exodus and didn't get a family, an Afghan family, and so they sent us some things that they'd been collecting and couldn't use, and asked questions about all of that.
That's
and
great.
then it faded away.
Okay,
But
yeah. And that's how it goes
they were
sometimes.
given, the regional office hooked them up. So just saying, it's
Oh,
not
yeah.
just you that does the hooking up.
So Rick did it too.
The regional
Rick
office,
is
Rick
good.
and Carolyn
Boy.
also.
Boy, Rick is good. I just know Rick better. That's why I said his name. Yeah, other questions? No? Okay. Oh, I see. So you're paid to say these things. Okay, I understand. That's great. Well, another thing that Exodus has mentioned to me is that they would like to do a little bit. Jericho called it warehouse days, which you don't have to commit to the whole co-sponsoring program. That sometimes they have volunteer needs at their, center where they're at, and that they would like, if it's possible, to almost do, and I would need to probably have conversations with some clergy leaders, or now that I know that the region's basically based out of here, some other people, to see about getting just a larger group of disciples from all over Indianapolis that might be interested just to come and to do the volunteer work, but also to do some of that networking and relationship building so that they can learn more about Exodus, so Exodus can learn more about them. You know, as was already shared, please forgive me, I've forgotten your name.
Deb.
Deb. As Deb shared, sometimes they call congregations to see, hey, we need help with XYZ. Can you help us with this? The most often requested thing is for landlords. That it's such a big deal to try to find safe and affordable housing. And so if you know any good landlords, pass them along to Deb. But no, that there are other volunteer opportunities outside of the co-sponsoring, and that it can create a wider relational network of disciples congregations more broadly. So I may be reaching out to you to see if we could coordinate or plan something like that in the future. I don't have to just keep talking. We can bring our time to a close if you all have no more questions. So the Exodus is responsible for finding the housing. Now they can ask churches to say, hey, do you have ideas, or do you have people, or are there places that you would recommend? But the housing has to be independent. So as much as it's very kind for some people to say, you know, I live alone, I'd be happy to have 5 people come here for 90 days, it has to be an independent living situation. But that the resettlement offices will find the housing, sometimes with the help of congregations, but they're responsible for finding the housing. Okay. Well, thank you all very much for having me and for the conversation, and I'm very grateful for all this. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan, so very much. And thank all of you for being here and supporting Week of Compassion and learning more about it. And obviously, it sounds like there'll be some next steps, too, that might be may land in our laps. And we will open our arms willingly for that. So I'd like to remind you that you can make offerings in that plate, just like we would leave the church and leave our offering there. You can do that if you'd like to, or go online to make a contribution, and we'll make sure that Alan's office gets it. So with that being said, and if there's no other further questions, this is your last-ditch chance to get this expert. It's so nice to have him. I will close us in prayer then. Loving and gracious God, how good it is to be in your presence tonight, to be inspired to help our neighbors in need. Thank you for the work that Alan does and his colleagues, and I pray your blessings upon them so that more people can be reached, that we can love on them and care for them in a way that Jesus would care and love. Thank you for taking care of us and our neighbors. And sometimes we do that one person at a time, sometimes families at a time, or sometimes cities and countries. But help us to serve you. And if we are able to do that through our church, Week of Compassion, we give thanks for those opportunities. Please be with us now as we all head out our different ways, and special travel blessings and mercies upon Alan. In your name we pray together. Amen.